On this very special occasion, I feel charged with memories, emotions, and all that I had shared with her over all these years. There were moments of jubilation when Imagining Pen created history in 1982. There were moments of deep anguish and suffering when violence, barbarities, horrors came on the scene. And it was a great experience to share in all these through the perceptions of this great lady. And when I speak of cinema across cultures, by culture I mean these perceptions, self-perceptions. Self-perceptions which have to be artistically recreated to bear them out, carry them out to other cultures. And this becomes a historical role of cinema. Cinema, if you really remember, came into being in 1895, and in 1914 the world had its first great shock in a world scale, the first of its kind. For this was the first war in the history of the world, but it was not a war, not a battle being fought in a single small space. If you really come to think of all the old wars of the world, whether in history or in mythology, they're all histories which relate to small places, place names, whether it's Panipat or Palasi, whether it's Kangla or the great Kurukshetra, whether it's Lanka or Lahore. These were battles, wars, fights, contests, which took place in a small place, and you can indicate it by the place name. But this was a world war, for the first time ever. A war which spread fast throughout the world. And this was a war which was not just the world's first world war, it was also a war which changed the very meaning, the very nature, the very identification of war. In the sense that all the wars in the past had been fought with weapons. Weapons that brought man and man together in a confrontation, where the killer and the killed shared the same space. A space defined by sight, hearing, smell, the closeness of the victim and the killer. They shared a common space. The space defined by the senses, by the indriyas. The First World War was the first war in which there were bombs that dropped from flying aeroplanes. This was the first war in which shells from the cannons could go to a space, a length of 100 miles. And this was considered to be a great achievement of civilization. The spread, the reach of its destructive power. And now it was no longer the victim and the killer sharing a space. The machine, the weapon had intervened in that space. At the same time, this was also the time that broadcasting and cinema had started spreading throughout the world. In fact, people were glued to the radio sets in the years of the First World War. And people were glued to the cinema screens, watching, recording, experiencing the progress of the war. The war was no longer a distant reality, something taking place somewhere else, far away from your safe space in home. The war could come into your home and heart any time. The way the war spread, you had to keep informed. You had to be aware of the danger, the risk, the closeness of the risk. And therefore, the radio became a tool on which you depended for your survival, depended for your safety. And the cinema gave you images of the war. The war was a reality which could not be captured in words alone. They had to be captured in their enormity, in their images. And the cinema gave you the images. The cinema gave you the images of countries and peoples and cultures about which you were not aware till then. Distant places where the war was taking place. Distant peoples, distant nations, distant races involved in the war, whom you didn't know. And you would like to recognize because they were becoming real in the process of history. So, the time of the origin of cinema, the time cinema came into being and achieved its international spread, was also the time when cultures came into conflict, into confrontation, and opened up areas of curiosity, interest, trying to understand other cultures. Just as cultures fought cultures, so cultures aligned with new cultures to form their defenses, to come to terms to resist some other marauding culture. The whole pattern of civilization was changing as cinema evolved. And this has given cinema a special character and a special role. And that is a theme on which I would like to touch. Cinema is primarily, essentially, first and foremost, a pictorial medium. A medium of images, things that you see as pictures, recorded by the camera. And the camera is trusted to be the most authentic recording medium. Something that captures all the external details, all the contours, everything in the shape of an object. Whether it's a tree or a machine, whether it's a human face or a human body, anything. The most authentic, the most trustworthy recording of an object is offered by photography. And when these photographs move, when these images move, you get into cinematography, into cinema, and that is your most authentic feel of reality. You record reality. And that remains cinema's primary concern, to capture the real. And the more authentic, the more trustworthy, the more credible you can make your reality, the more rich in its space and in its time, in its history, in its culture and location, the more real you can make it, the more you can extend the real into a supra-real, into a reality beyond the immediate reality. Something which is so basic to the human imagination. Human imagination is never satisfied, never contented with what it has, what it can see. It always dreams beyond. It always reaches beyond. And that's the area where life turns into poetry, where life turns into music, where life turns into dance, which is not life as it is, life as it is practiced every day, but life with its possibilities. Human beings walk on the ground. The ground is so solid, but the dancer hopes to leap beyond the ground into a different space, a space beyond the earth. When we talk, we share ideas, we share concepts, but when we break into song, these are no longer words or concepts. These are fields of feeling, emotions that grow beyond the words, things that you can't put into words, things that you can only sing. All the possibilities of going beyond the real, not our given human conditions, but different conditions, changed conditions, conditions at another level of civilization. These aspirations and these yearnings, these also cinema captures. But captures only out of the reality, the feel of the reality. The earthiness of the reality has to be there before you can go into a flights of imagination. So it becomes so imperative for cinema to come back to its moorings in a particular culture. And this is something that cinema grew out of. And the more and more in the history of cinema, cinema is over 100 years old already, 100 years old even in India. In these 100 years, there came a time when that magic potential of cinema, the capacity of cinema to touch reality, to understand reality, to embed itself in reality, and then break beyond reality into the flight of imagination into the future. That turned into a commodity. That was snatched away from human imagination into the code of business and profit and the massive mechanism of capitalism, making money out of it. And to make money, to make larger profits, you don't have to stick to cultures, real cultures. You create a false, unreal, universal culture. A culture of consumers, a culture of buyers. And then the more rootless you can turn cinema, the more you tear cinema away from its cultural roots. And by cultural roots, I don't just mean cultural performances or practices. I also mean the flowers, the birds, the beasts, the insects in a particular culture. I think of the magic of the Ingele flower in my friend Shan Sharma's Ishanu, which you will be watching a few minutes later. How the flower stirs something in a woman's heart, changes her totally. Something which is part of the culture, part of the imagination, part of the history, the practice, even in that very, very special flower. In a piece, Satyajit Ray speaks of his encounter with this great French director, Jean Renoir, who came down to India to shoot a film. And he was charmed by a flower. And he told Rai, look at that flower, it's so beautiful. But there are flowers all over the world. But this particular flower, this blooms only here. So that flower marks this place for me, identifies this place for me. That flower, and side by side, he could also identify a city far away from France, the country from where he came, by the hanging clothes set out for drying under the sun. It's a different sun in India, not the sun that shines in France. The skies are different. The temperature is different. The sun is different. And the sun and the drying clothes, they have a different contact, they have a different dynamism, and that is also part of the culture. All these things go into the making of culture, and cinema is so potentially capable of capturing these signs and traits of the culture. But in the capitalist standardization, in the capitalist pursuit of a large market, cinema becomes something standardized, and cinema loses its cultural bearings, its cultural identity. It becomes a saleable commodity everywhere. And as you go out to the everywhere, you trample on these separate identities, on the separate cultures. There is a capitalist aggression against the different voices, the different sensitivities that have been cultivated and nurtured with such great care over generations. For us, in 1982, when outside Manipur, we had a first exposure to Shyam's imagining pen, it was a moment of history. For us in Bengal, for example, Manipur for years was a Manipuri dance, and not even the entire rich repertoire of the Manipuri dance. It was basically only the rasa and the variations of the rasa. An extremely limited repertoire. And Manipur was identified with that. But the living practices of this place, what so charmingly and what so magically came through in Imagining Pen, that decision of a woman to adopt a child whose mother had been betrayed by her husband. A strange power lay in that spirit of responsibility, of taking responsibility, of assuming responsibility. And that was a revelation. And through that cultural trait, through that decision, a cultural sign, which was unique, which was special, we found an entry point into the rich history of Manipur's women's wars, women's battles, and women's culture. Their battles for identity, the battles for the rights, the battles for larger human rights. So, it opens up Manipur, it opens up a place, its people, its culture, to another culture. And the more cinema can work at that level, at the level of these intersections, where one culture is set against another, the more understanding grows. And cinema, because of its capacity to capture the real and then rise above the real to the imaginary super real. That range, that trajectory that cinema alone can cover with that power. A power which also rests in the hypnosis that you have in a cinema auditorium. In an auditorium like this, for example. I'm so happy, I'm so excited to be speaking at this new auditorium. I visited it in 2010, which was a time when it was being setting up, the construction was going on. Now the construction is complete. Even this occasion of a collective, of a community, of a whole mass of people sitting together, sharing something for a given period of time, in all the rush and bustle of life all around, you are cut off from that to concentrate on a work of creation, a cinematic creation, and as the hall goes dark and the light rests on the screen alone, a rectangular frame, and things happen there, and so many eyes with different kinds of lines and memories and imaginations behind them, concentrate on the same images and see the same movements of images and read different meanings, different histories, different emotions in the experience that cinema offers. This collectivity, this collective space, this has also to be reclaimed at a point of time when the television set in your home has taken this space away from us, more and more taking that space away, so that you are no longer a part of a community. You are stuck in your home, in your insularity, not with a collective, not with a mass of people with whom you can share something and share its joy and jubilation and pains. So as we stand at this point of crisis, maybe, it is also a point where there is a challenge to creativity, a challenge to reclaim and recapture the cultural nuances, the cultural specialties of cinema, and to reclaim the cultural space where a community, where a collective watches and shares the cinematic experience. And that is what brings me to this point where we talk of cinema across cultures, cinema offering cultures, cinema receiving cultures, so that a culture does not get subsumed by a larger culture. A culture which is hegemonic, which imposes its power on a smaller culture through political power, through powers of technology, and in the process standardizes humanity, standardizes the very subtle feelings, the caring feelings, the concerned feelings that people share in a community, in a closer community. The larger community always becomes a sort of a monster, too large for human beings to deal with, too overpowering to have our voices heard and communicated. The need for cinema to rediscover these smaller cinemas, the original cinemas. It may seem utopian, with the power of money, with the power that goes into the commercial cinema in its large, expansive forays, even in the context of the lies, the blatant lies that are circulated by the media all the time, the lies about the successes of the big cinemas of the commercial cinemas. Most of the time, these are false statements. When you hear of big hits, you don't really get to know the truth of the things, of the money invested and the money that is returned. The conspiracies of black money, the secret deals, where it is not cinema reaching and pleasing a large enough audience. It's a business conspiracy. It's a business machination, which the media presents to you as a success story and as the model, as something that overawes you to the point where you can't create your own works. And yet, we have models, we have experiences of great filmmakers who have created their audiences, not enormous audiences, not large audiences. I'll read out some excerpts from a very dear, favorite filmmaker of mine, a filmmaker on whose films I grew up, in a sense, Auditorium. And when he talks about his film, about 25 years after he had made his first film, after 25 years of filmmaking, international recognition, awards, and everything, he says, the main incentive for me was provided by the insipid, hidebound, hybrid nature of Bengali films, which had discovered early on what the audience wanted and stayed resolutely on the safe path. There were no great hopes of success for his films, but he was a sensitive man, deeply rooted in his culture, deeply rooted in his literature, who discovered the power of images that could translate and transmute and transform the words of a literary text. And it's the fascination of that power and his sense of the frustration at how a cinema commercially minded, just feeding what the audience wanted, what the audience demanded, and never challenging the taste of the audience, the power of the media. That is something that angered him, created a rage of passion and inspiration in him to go for cinema. And even after these 25 years of filmmaking and great recognition, he says, in the rest of India, where even in the major cities, my films are either never shown or shown surreptitiously on Sunday mornings, generally without subtitles. I am only a name and have been one for all of these 25 years. It certainly gives one an odd feeling. He doesn't become popular in India automatically. It gives him an odd feeling to feel all this. But still it goes on till the 1990s, the early 1990s, till he dies making films with the same passion, with the same commitment. And there is always this hope. And something another contemporary of his, Mrinal Sen, once said so wonderfully when he was asked, well, you make films for a minority. You make films for people only in your culture. What do you make of that? How can you really reach out? You never become a big star as a filmmaker. You play to the minorities. And Mrinal Sen said very sensitively, if you add up all these minorities, they make a considerable majority throughout the world, throughout the country itself. And after all, the minority has a right to be heard and seen. So if we are talking of a cinema that can capture a culture, reflect a culture, resonate with its own culture, and take the culture beyond to other cultures. We are talking also of the voice of the minority, the right of the minority to be heard, the right of a culture to be heard across cultures, rather than become decimated by some strong industrial apparatus which denies you your culture. So it is your love for your culture, it is your commitment to your culture that should bring you back to a cinema that upholds your culture. Cinema has to be taken out of the basket of industry alone and given a relocation at the heart of culture, because their cinema allows for a kind of sharing that no other media, no other art form even can give to that extent, in its hold over the real and the supra-real.